changing zoning rules in New York to allow a greater focus on health and equity would require changing the New York City Charter. And I think that's something that both those of us in the food movement and elected officials should think about. And zoning laws were originally set up in the late 19th and early 20th century to protect health. And the challenges that we face in the 21st century are a little different, and maybe we need to rethink that. And that is worthy of very serious consideration before we put a policy proposal out, but I encourage that to think about that. And the last thing I want to say is just adding a chapter to the Whole Foods story. You know, one group of investors is putting money in building a new Whole Foods in Harlem. At the same time, a group of real estate developers, Excel, has bought up the building where Pathmark is located. It's planning to close Pathmark, lower end food store. And so you have a change, capital moving into one type of store and moving out of another type of store. And our center is doing essentially a health impact assessment of the potential closing of Pathmark and what's that going to do to food availability needs to Harlem.
So in Brooklyn, there's so many really amazing people of color-led initiatives that I think are important to lift up, like the Brooklyn Movement Center, who's doing work around building a co-op, a people's-led co-op, and very critical and deliberate around making sure that we're thinking about access, making sure we're thinking about leadership, making sure we're thinking about all the ways in which oppression intersects and how we access food, also cost and sourcing and things of that nature. And I think that that's really critical work, because a lot of times we're in kind of some lanes over here, like we care about sustainability on one, or we care about workers, but you have people who are trying to be thoughtful all the way around too. We have Hattie Carthen, who is doing really amazing work too. They have a farmer's market also on Urban Farm, teaching young people how to grow. And I actually want to lift up our own work too at Food and Fitness at Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation. What we're doing is working with black farmers at a farmer's market with Brooklyn Rescue Mission. And we're also sourcing and working with farmers and leading up farm to Head Start work throughout Brooklyn. And we've worked with 10 Head Start centers to start, and we're expanding to 25, where we talked centers into shifting the way they're sourcing, into sourcing from our local farmers, and also being very thoughtful about where our food comes from, connecting young people back to. I think it's so critical to say back to, because we don't want to negate, again, the historical connection that our communities have with food and agriculture. And so we're doing that really critical work, and also building co-ops, buying clubs. Jessica Gordon-Emhart, if anybody hasn't seen it, came out with a new book. She's based here in New York City. Came out with a new book called Collective Courage, The History of African Americans and Cooperatives. It is a critical book, and I suggest everybody pick it up if you can. Excuse me. And then I just want to also shout out Bugs, Black Farmers, Urban Gardeners, who is here in New York too, and have done national convenings of black folks in food and urban ag. We have the Black Project here. We have a mobile market in the Bronx. We have also one last shout out I wanted that I'm very honored to be a part of is the New York Food Forum, who last, I think October, we've been all working together, some multiracial folks who are really centered in equity and racial equity, who brought together I guess hundreds of folks last October, to talk about race and equity in our food system and how we can move forward. So those are some very promising ways and things that I see happening and work that's being done.
My colleagues and I have published work demonstrating that fast food in New York City is strongly contained within racial borders. The density of fast food restaurants is strongly and positively related to the proportion of black residents in a neighborhood, so that the more black residents there are, the more fast food there is. And in our study, race was the strongest predictor by far. So much as Dara was saying, it's not about income. Median household income was essentially unrelated. I would argue that the spatial distribution of fast food also serves to define and harden racial boundaries. The siting of these restaurants is far from benign, and our concern about its stubborn entrenchment in black neighborhoods stop not just at the body as it relates to obesity, but also with regard to the ways in which fast food acts as a vehicle for racial exclusion and subordination. Relegating a problematic commodity like fast food to black spaces reifies blackness as problematic and perpetuates racial hierarchy. So that if fast food is gauche, homogeneous, and anachronistic, so too are the populations it targets disproportionately. The general public inveighs against fast food consumers as gluttonous, morally suspect, and somewhat gross, particularly if they're caught feeding fast food to their children, and even more so if they are black. And a special kind of a program is reserved for those who are also overweight. Withering critiques are leveled at impulse control challenged people of color, who show no mastery over self-defeating urges for fattening foods. It's all about demand, critics assert. Those restaurants wouldn't be there if there was no demand, wouldn't they? In another study, we found demand to be unrelated to store location across a variety of retail categories. And if Black and Latino New Yorkers purportedly like hamburgers so much, how come there aren't any Shake Shacks in East New York? Not that I'm saying East New York is deprived because it doesn't have Shake Shack, but we have to think about why certain kinds of fast food are in some neighborhoods and others are not. One potentially promising approach is to look at race and racism as a function of zoning. So in 2005, Julie Samia Mayer and her colleagues produced a guide for planners on zoning and fast food. So they reviewed the kinds of zoning ordinances that exist in municipalities across the country and how they've been implemented. And so the purpose and methods of these zoning restrictions vary a lot. They range from banning restaurants that use drive-through service, banning quote-unquote formula restaurants, banning restaurants in certain areas that have distinctive commercial districts or certain historic character. And then also regulating the number of restaurants or the distance between restaurants. So those are all different approaches that have been used. They've also looked at distance between fast food restaurants and other uses such as schools, churches, and hospitals. But the underlying tenor of these regulations characterizes fast food as a LULU, and a locally unwanted land use, that harms neighborhood character and prestige. And it contributes to physical disorder. People complain about noise and litter and throngs of people. And then it also looks at whether fast food disrupts land use patterns. At the time, authors noted that there had yet to be any zoning ordinances that were enacted with obesity as the rationale. So that actually changed a few years later. So in 2008, many of you may know that in Los Angeles, the city council enacted a ban on new fast food restaurants entering heavily saturated Black and Latino South LA.
We know that when we employ a structural race analysis, what we're really doing is looking at the institutions, policies, and actors that are both part of the problem and driving the problem, and that also have to be catalyzed to be part of that solution, right? And we know that policy is a driver of the arrangements of the structures and the way in which the interconnected nature of the outcomes that we see. So, and just to also say that when we're thinking about an equity analysis or a structural race analysis, we also have to understand the power relationships, to Dara's point, in all of that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the national work that we've been a part of, and then some of the key levers, I think, that are so important to the discussion about food policy at the New York City level. So nationally, we've been part of a food movement. I think it's an interesting thing to call the food space right now, but I think that we're coalescing towards really having the key foundations of having a food movement. And one of those is really about understanding what our collective vision is, right? So if we don't know where we're going, any road will take us there. And so, so it's really important for us to really think about if we as a food movement, if that means the people in this room, right? If we're successful, what would be different in the world? That's how we have to measure impact, right? And we have to be on the same page about what we mean when we're talking about racial equity. What do we mean when we're talking about sharing power? And how are we defining these terms? And what is the food system ultimately that we want to build and create and drive? And so I think that some of that work is the foundational work we've been doing with a core group of folks working in food and ag policy at the national level, local leaders like Dara, folks working on labor and immigration like Diana Robinson and others. And so building out what a just, equitable, fair food system looks like is step one. The second is understanding, again, the power. Corporate power, corporate control. We know who owns our food system for the most part, right? If not, there's plenty of resources listed here that outline that. But, in order for us to, if on one side of the equation are all that power, moneyed interest, and the other side is, our movement, what does it actually mean for us to balance those scales, right? We have to think across labor, across immigration, across access and affordability, across environmental hazards, across obesity, across hunger. We actually have to have a deeper alignment, understanding that our collective goal is the same, and thinking about what's our role and how can we be good allies and actors in supporting each other, right? Because we know that our health outcomes are, as Nick said, so closely related to the food that we eat. We know that it's absolutely connected to what food is available in our neighborhoods. We know that it's absolutely connected to our ability to get to that food, so transit investments, our ability to, if we're starting a new business around food, our ability to get that to market, which means our broadband infrastructure, right? So, and our internet access. And those aren't issues that we necessarily think of when we're thinking of the food system. But when the bottom line is that absolutely impacts our ability to access and afford food, right? Our jobs.